Parents abandoned me at 14 at my grandma's house for being a freak due to my medical issues. Now they're begging me for my inheritance to help my brother get out of his mess. When I was younger, I had been diagnosed with epilepsy pretty early. It was unfortunate because my parents were not really equipped to deal with that sort of thing, emotionally or mentally, and they started treating me like some sort of diseased child they couldn't handle. I think I was around 6 years old when I first noticed how differently they treated my brother and me. My brother was 3 years older than me, and my parents treated him far better than they treated me, presumably because he was easier to handle compared to me. And as if epilepsy wasn't enough, the cherry on top was when I was diagnosed with dyslexia and severe ADHD at the age of 8. Needless to say, my parents had their hands full with me. It would be one thing if they were kind people who were grateful to have a child and were up for the challenge. But they were the ones who decided to have a baby and should have been prepared for what comes with it. I guess they assumed that since my brother had turned out perfectly healthy and fine, I would be absolutely healthy as well, and did not see this coming. Since I'd been born already, they had no choice but to deal with me. They made sure I felt that way too, like they were tolerating me, and it wasn't nice. I didn't have a very fun and normal childhood, not just because of my illnesses, but also because of my parents. In fact, most of my childhood misery was caused by my parents, not my illnesses. The way they responded to it and treated me really made me upset. They always treated me like a pariah in my own family, and I never felt included. They made sure to make me feel like an unwanted burden. They would walk on eggshells around me, and it was like every time I walked into a room, they would stop talking instantly, and all the life would be sucked out of that room just because I had arrived. This treatment continued when I was under 10 years old, and it only got worse with time. My mental health was pretty fragile, and I just couldn't take it. So, I started misbehaving in my teenage years. The adolescent hormones combined with the misery of growing up in a home where I always felt unwanted broke my heart, and I started acting out. I stopped putting any effort into studying and started flunking out of all my classes on purpose, just because I was so angry with my parents and how they were treating me. I was defiant, disobedient, and downright rude to everybody I knew. I was pushing everybody away, even my friends, and I knew it was not the right thing to do, but I was so miserable that I didn't know how else to get my parents to pay attention to me. Even then, they didn't seem to care much. Every time they were summoned by the school, because I had broken a rule or misbehaved in some way, they would just sigh in disappointment, but not even bother to reprimand me. It was incredibly frustrating, and I hated being with them. I would even throw temper tantrums in the house and try to get their attention that way, but they would just ignore me altogether and talk among themselves, not even bothering to lower their voices so I wouldn't hear them. They would say things like I was having a fit again and keep rolling their eyes at me, telling me to be normal. That was the most I could get out of them, and it was really heartbreaking. When I was 14, I broke a major rule in school. I brought a pack of cigarettes to school and started smoking one right in the middle of class. When my teacher demanded that I stop and told me to get out of class, I flipped him off. That was the last straw for me, because I had already been quite a troublemaker at school before that. But I had always been let off the hook because my parents would tell everyone that I was not a normal kid and not exactly right in the head, so they had to excuse my behavior. But after that, there was no going back. I got expelled, and that was the one time my parents were actually furious with me. They tore into me that day and said things I don't think I'll ever be able to forget or forgive. It wasn't stuff I didn't know already, but it just hurt to hear them say it out loud. They told me they regretted ever having me, and had they known I would turn out to be such a psychotic little kid, they never would have gone on with the pregnancy and would have terminated it as soon as they found out. They called me a burden on the family and said they were better off when they had just one son. They were going to make sure I left the family and never came back again. I was grounded for 1 week, and for that week, they literally locked me in my room. They didn't allow me to come out for anything, apart from bathroom breaks, and even my meals were sent up to my room. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere or speak to anybody, and I was absolutely miserable. I felt like a prisoner in solitary confinement, except this was much worse because it was my own parents doing it to me. I don't think I had committed a crime. I had just been acting out, and I think it was kind of on them because they had never given me the attention I wanted or needed. They were the ones who screwed up, and I admit I wasn't the easiest to deal with due to my illnesses, but they should have considered that before deciding to have a baby. After 1 week of being treated like that, I finally found out what they meant when they said I would never be allowed back into the family again. Out of the blue, my parents told me to get into the car with all my stuff. My brother and my mom packed my things for me while I waited in the car, and about an hour later, I was all packed, and we were driving. It was a familiar route, and in a few minutes, I realized we were heading to my grandmother's place, my dad's mom. I thought maybe they were going to let me live there for a couple of weeks to get my head straight, because I knew my grandma was a strict disciplinarian, but also had a soft spot for me and treated me much better than my parents. I didn't think it was going to be a punishment, but once we got there, I realized this wasn't going to be a temporary arrangement. They were dumping me at my grandmother's house so she could raise me because they were giving up on me and didn't want me around anymore. They had taken that week to convince my grandmother to raise me. When we reached my grandmother's house, my parents brought out all my things, left them at the door, and told me to carry them all in. They said this was going to be my new home, and they didn't want any contact with me ever again, especially not after what I had done. According to them, I had been trying my best to ruin their reputation, but now I had crossed a line and couldn't take it back. While we were at the door, I tried to beg them not to do this because in spite of everything, I still wanted to have a relationship with my parents. I don't know why. I was 14 and desperate to have some sense of belonging in my family. It was difficult to accept they were dumping me at my grandma's place. I was also concerned about whether my grandma could take care of me since she was getting old and was already in her 60s. I knew she loved me, but I didn't know if she actually wanted to take me in. I felt like I was just going from being a burden to my parents to being a burden to my grandmother. I didn't want to disappoint her because even in the past, whenever I visited her and she learned about my antics at home and school, she would be quite disappointed but always encourage me. She would tell me she knew I was made of stronger stuff and tried to convince me my parents would come around if I behaved better. That was another reason I didn't want to move in with my grandmother. I felt like she would start resenting me too, just like my parents did, and I couldn't afford to lose her too. So, I begged them to let me stay, but they said they had made up their minds. Right in front of me, they told my grandmother they were done with me and didn't want to hear about me. They said they didn't want a freak like me living with them anymore and wanted to focus on my very normal brother. That really got to me because that's the kind of language bullies at school used to make fun of me. It hurt to hear my parents use the same words. It was one thing for mean kids at school to say it. I was used to it. But when my parents called me a freak, I realized they were the biggest bullies of my life. Actually, they were doing me a favor by letting me live with my grandma because they never loved me no matter what I did. Even if I had behaved better, they probably wouldn't have cared because, to them, my brother was the only child they had. After that, I stopped begging and accepted that I was going to live with my grandma. I decided in my head that I was going to be better because I deserved better, and so did my grandma. I wasn't going to throw away my life just because my parents didn't love me. Once my parents left, my grandmother and I sat down and had a much-needed conversation. She told me she loved me, but hadn't been ready to take me in, and had concerns because she had heard about my behavior from my father. She said at her age, it wasn't possible to handle a troubled kid like me. She understood I needed help, but wasn't sure she could provide the right space for me to grow up. That's why it took her a week to decide. After my father told her he had grounded me and kept me locked in my room for a week, she decided he wasn't the right kind of parent to raise me and apologized for not intervening sooner. She had herself to worry about as well since she was a widow and didn't have much of her own. She wasn't sure if taking me in and adopting me was the right thing, but now that she learned how badly I was treated, she understood why I was acting out and told me she wanted a fresh start with me. She wanted to do right by me, unlike my parents. She said I should see this as an opportunity, and that's what I did. I apologized for everything I had done and told her I forgave her for not intervening sooner. We decided to put the past behind us and work together for a better future. I'm always thankful to my grandmother for everything she did for me, because I truly don't think I would have become the person I am today if she hadn't been part of my life and decided to take me in. I turned my life around with her help, and that's why I'm where I am today. After moving in with my grandma, I made a conscious effort to be better at everything I did. She tried to do right by me, helped me, and provided the space I needed to excel. She got the right tutors to help me with academics and enrolled me in private school, making sure everyone knew I had needs to be catered to, so they wouldn't treat me like every other student. Unlike my parents, she didn't use my condition as an excuse but as a reason to provide the help I needed. It helped me, and I graduated with good scores and went to college like any other kid. I was able to do everything I wanted, and for that, I only have my grandmother to thank. My parents continued to visit my grandmother occasionally, but they never saw me, and I stayed out of their way. Every time they visited, I left the house and only came back after they had left. They didn't seem to care, and neither did I. That went on for a couple of years, but then my grandmother had a big fight with them about it. She told them they were horrible parents for not even attempting to talk to me, especially when I was doing better, and they had a reason to talk to me and apologize for what they did. They refused to acknowledge their mistakes while raising me and pretended they were perfect parents and I was just a bad kid. They called me a rotten apple and a freak again, and my grandma lost it, telling them never to come back. They stuck to it. They were so egoistic they couldn't accept they were not good parents to me, and that's why I turned out the way I did at 14. Because of my grandma's guidance, I improved, yet they couldn't comprehend that. After that, we didn't talk to them for almost 10 years. My grandma and I pretended they never existed. I achieved so much and hit many milestones, but I never spoke to my parents, and they never reached out to me even though I had social media and never blocked them. They could have reached out, but they chose not to. Now they have reached out because my grandma passed away a couple of months ago. It was very upsetting for me since she was the only person who genuinely had my back no matter what. Even though we hadn't been living together for the past couple of years since I moved out for college and then graduated and got my place, she was still my rock and support system. Life has been very different without her, and I was still coping with her loss when I heard from my parents. Not even 6 months have passed since she died, but they're already at my door demanding I share my inheritance because apparently my very normal and healthy brother isn't doing better than I am as they expected, and now they need my help to clean up his mess. They visited me a few days ago, and my brother wasn't with them, which was surprising because he always came along before. I decided to talk to them because I thought they were here to apologize. But after a bit of small talk and condolences, they got straight to the point. They told me that while in college, my brother had developed a bit of a drug habit, and now it affected his ability to work. I don't know why they were downplaying it because from what I gathered, he was in serious trouble and needed help. They wanted me to share my inheritance with them whenever I got the money so they could pay for rehab. I asked why he couldn't attend a low-cost program they could afford, and they told me they had tried, but it wasn't good enough, and he needed a residential program which cost a lot. I don't know anyone who has been to rehab, and I don't know how much it costs. I'm not going to find out. All I know is I have my own money now since I have a good job and am comfortable. My grandmother was also pretty well off since my grandfather left her a lot of money, and she invested it carefully, which is good for me, but bad for my parents because despite knowing that, they were too proud to keep in touch or apologize to her towards the end, knowing they would probably need the money. I didn't care about any of that. I told my parents I was ready to help them with whatever amount they needed, but there was one condition. They had to publicly acknowledge everything they did in the past VDJ, the terrible way they treated me, the things they said, and how they treated my grandmother. Then, they had to acknowledge they needed my help, and why. Everyone should know what was going on because for years, we kept things private since my grandma didn't want any drama. But now that they came to me and had the audacity to ask for help, they had to acknowledge their wrongdoings for me to move on. They tried to negotiate and told me I was being unreasonable and selfish, but I told them that was my condition, and they could take it or leave it. I had no issues providing the money they needed. I had nothing against my brother anymore, but they had to acknowledge what they did so I could completely move on from the past. They treated me badly, and there was no way around it. They hadn't been nice to my grandmother either, and this was her money we were talking about. If they wanted her money, they had to acknowledge what they did. It was that simple. When I told them this, their faces fell. They called me heartless and emotionless and said they never expected this from me. I told them they shouldn't have expected anything from me at all, since we hadn't spoken in 10 years. If they wanted my help, they had to acknowledge and accept their mistakes and apologize. That's it. I didn't want to hear anything more about it. They left after a lot of crying and accusations, but I didn't budge. Now they're trying to change my mind and telling me my brother is in a bad condition and needs my help. I don't understand why they expect me to do things for them when I never expected anything from them. My grandmother and I only had each other. They never bothered to help or check on us. Even when my grandmother passed away, they probably wouldn't have found out if I hadn't told relatives. So why should I help people who had nothing to do with us for 10 years? Even then, I just want to make sure I'm justified in telling my parents I won't help them financially if they don't accept and acknowledge their mistakes publicly. Update. Thank you for all the comments on my original post. I'm doing fine, thank you for asking. It has been really difficult dealing with the loss of my grandmother, but she was really old, and I'm glad she's in a better place now. She lived her life to the fullest and didn't pass away with any regrets. Thank you for the concern and condolences. My parents are still trying to bother me online, but I told them if they don't do as I said, they can give up hope of inheriting any money. I know my grandmother left everything to me in her will, and I'm sure my parents know about it since the lawyer sent an email. Now all they can do is sit and wail. I'm not going back on my word. It has been a week since I last spoke to them, and since none of their pleas have worked, they have resorted to sending me photos of my brother. He looks bad. They keep sending pictures, telling me he needs my help, and that I should step up and do something for him. To that, I only have one thing to say. Where were they when I needed that kind of help? They abandoned me, and I was lucky my grandmother had my back. Otherwise, I don't know where I would have ended up. They didn't care about me, and as much as I feel bad for my brother, I can't help them if they don't apologize for what they did. It has to be public because I want everyone to know what kind of people they are. If they can keep their egos aside just for this, I'll help them out. For me, it's about shattering their pride. It was their pride that made them do everything. Now, if they want to help the child they claim to love, they have to keep it aside. I want to see what comes first for them, my brother or their pride. Update 2. 10 days have passed since I last spoke to my parents. After a while, I stopped responding to their messages. They showed up at my place a couple of hours ago, bringing my brother along. It was bad. At the door, I told them they couldn't do this, and their behavior was damaging their chances of getting anything from me because I wasn't comfortable with them doing this, not even to my brother. I told them to leave, and for a while they refused and said if I wanted them to leave, I had to promise to help them as soon as possible. I told them I wouldn't make any promises, and if they tried to mess with me, I would call the police, which wouldn't be good for them given my brother's condition. That scared them, and they left. My dad told me my grandmother and I were the most selfish people on the planet, which is rich coming from them, considering they dumped me on her doorstep because they couldn't deal with a special needs kid. Actually, they didn't want to deal with me because I wasn't the perfect boy they expected. If my grandmother and I are selfish, the words to describe them haven't been invented yet. Update 3. Hi, I kind of forgot to post here because I got busy with work. Almost 2 months have passed since my last update, and a lot has changed. My parents are blocked now and have no way to contact me anymore. I moved into a better apartment in a new neighborhood, so they don't have my address. I made it known to all my relatives that they are not to give out my address to anybody, especially my parents. Last time, someone decided my parents deserved to know where I lived because their son was suffering and gave them my address, which is how they contacted me. This time, I made sure that won't happen. After the last conversation when my dad called me selfish, I blocked them because I didn't want the drama. They showed me that their pride would always come first, above everything, even the son they claimed to love. I can accept they never loved me because of my dyslexia and ADHD, but my brother was someone they always claimed to love and was perfect to them. How they couldn't make one little sacrifice for him was beyond me. All they had to do was acknowledge their mistake, which would have been easy because most of our family already knew about the bad blood between us. They didn't want to apologize for their mistakes because they thought they were perfect. Well, they can keep their beliefs and I'll keep my inheritance. Fair enough.